in a very cross tone. At this the baby bear popped his head right out of his mother's pouch and blinked very hard.
"If you are so particular, I'll send along a friend of mine who will suit you very well."
And saying this, Mrs. Magpie gave the tree a savage peck and flew off. Imagine Mrs. Koala's surprise when she peeped down the tree later on and saw Mrs. Snake slowly wriggling her way upwards. Oh, she was frightened.
"Go away, Mrs. Snake,"
she called in a loud voice.
"I've come to nurse the baby Mrs. Magpie sent me."
And Mrs. Snake wriggled higher up the tree. Right onto the branch where Mrs. Koala sat she came, and coiled herself round the fork.
"I want a nurse."
And poor frightened Mrs. Bear tried to push the baby's head back in the pouch, but he would peep out.
"He's a nice little fellow, and like his daddy,"
said Mrs. Snake slyly.
"I can take him along on my back for such lovely rides, up and down trees, and in and out big black holes."
Hearing this, Mrs. Bear nearly fell off the tree with fright and began to cry. Now, Mr. Koala had been listening to Mrs. Snake as he sat on a branch just round the corner. Slowly he climbed over to Mrs. Snake and caught her in his claws. Before anyone had time to see what was happening, he pushed her off the branch and she went tumbling to the ground below. Two very frightened bears peeped down from the tree, and there they saw Mrs. Snake slowly crawling away in the grass. They were just beginning to recover from this fright when a thump, thump, thump was heard on the ground at the foot of the tree.
"Who's there?"
called Mrs. Bear in a very frightened voice.
"It's just me,"
came the reply.
"Who's me?"
growled Mr. Bear.
"Angelina Wallaby,"
called a very soft voice.
Come up,
Mrs. Bear replied.
"I can't climb. My tail is all wrong,"
said Angelina.
"Well, I'll come down if Mrs. Snake is nowhere about,"
said Mrs. Bear, and she slowly started to scramble down the tree. Very carefully she went, always grasping the tree with her strong claws, her back showing all the time, while she cleverly looked over her shoulder now and then to see that all was safe below. It took her quite a time to reach the ground, and she felt very nervous. Angelina Wallaby hopped over to her and gazed in wonderment at the baby.
"What a dear little fellow,"
she said, her great brown eyes rounding with excitement. At the same time she put out her paws to touch him.
"Oh, don't!"
cried Mrs. Bear.
"He's so small and your nails might hurt him."
"I've been all the morning blunting them on a stone so that I could pat him,"
said Angelina in a disappointed voice.
"Oh, I'm sorry,"
said Mrs. Bear.
"I didn't mean to be rude, but Mrs. Snake gave me such a fright."
"I'll be ever so gentle,"
said Angelina,
"if you let me pat him just this once."
"Very well,"
smiled Mrs. Bear as she opened her pouch. Angelina Wallaby patted him twice, then sniffed him all over with her soft, muzzly nose. Now her eyelashes caught in his little toes, but Angelina did not mind, as she had had babies herself and knew just what to do.
"I wish I could mind him for you sometimes, Mrs. Bear. I'd be so gentle with him."
"I'm sure you would be the very kindest nurse,"
replied Mrs. Bear.
"but what could you do for him?"
"I would come along in the evenings and take him out for a walk. I've got a pouch just like yours, and I'd tuck him in it and hop along very gently so he wouldn't feel the bumps."
"I think that is a good idea,"
said Mrs. Bear. So it was arranged that Mrs. Bear should climb down the tree every evening and meet Angelina Wallaby, who would take the baby for a walk in the bush. Imagine how proud Angelina felt. She hopped home very quickly that evening to tell her friends the news. Next day, just as the sun was setting, she came to the foot of the gum tree and thumped 3 times on the ground with her tail. Mrs. Bear peeped around the corner of her home, and seeing Angelina at the foot of the tree, called out,
"I'm cutting down with